This is Week in One, your wrap of the week's big news. Now, when an arrest was made in connection with the murder of Bafana Bafana captain Senzo Meyiwa, the authorities were fairly sure they had their man. But this week, the man was released. Prosecutors withdrawing charges on Tuesday. The NPA says it doesn't have enough evidence to prosecute Zamokuhle Mbatha. 25-year-old lives just 3 streets from the house where Meyiwa was murdered. And Mbatha has now fled his home. His family says he fears for his life.
I understand the anger and irritation of the public as relates to murders and robberies and other related crimes besieging our society. After careful consideration of the submissions that have been made, this court orders the immediate release of the accused Zamokuhle Mbatha from detention.
But only a week ago, the police were convinced they had the right man.
From the investigation thus far, we are sure that the person that we have now charged is one of the suspects that were involved in the incident.
Magistrate Daniel Tulane says it's natural for South Africans to want justice for Meyiwa's death, but says the NPA's decision to withdraw charges due to insufficient evidence must be respected.
Zamokuhle Mbatha's family rushed out of court, trying to avoid the sea of cameras. From the start, they've maintained he had nothing to do with Meyiwa's death. Meanwhile, the state says even though 2 witnesses had pointed out Mbatha in an identity parade, it wasn't enough.
We were not satisfied that, it will be fair and just to continue with the matter when we ourselves have so many questions around the identification parade, around the evidence that was gathered from the scene.
Police say they can recharge Mbatha if further evidence emerges. Narissa Subramani, Boksburg.
And in another blow for the NPA, on Friday morning, the man arrested in connection with the death of little Tigran Morris, who died in a botched hijacking in Reiger Park, also had all charges against him dropped. Now to international news, in fact to Nigeria now, and on Tuesday South Africa got the first real indication of when the repatriation of those who died in the Lagos church building collapse would be returned. Minister in the presidency, Jeff Khadebe, spoke from Nigeria, where he has been facilitating this entire process.
We stand ready as soon as we get a green light. Our infrastructure is in the ready. The aircrafts to transport our compatriots is also on the ready. If everything goes well, we should be able to repatriate them this coming weekend in order to arrive in South Africa on Sunday.
A total of 81 South Africans are presumed to have died when the Synagogue Church of All Nations guest house collapsed on the 12th of September. It's the biggest number of nationals to die in one incident since 1994. Now, the minister held closed-door meetings with government officials on Monday and Tuesday.
We need also to acknowledge the patience of the families of the deceased who for almost 2 months now have to endure the pain, the suffering and the emotions that go with it, so that we hope that this weekend these families would be able to put closure to these very tragic events.
The South African government says it's finalized plans to transport the deceased from Lagos as soon as clearance is given. Aduria Chumba, Lagos.
The return of those bodies has now been scheduled for this Sunday. We are covering it live here on ENCA. Now, the ongoing story, the inquiry into the Marikana massacre, has now wrapped up. Lawyers have been making their closing arguments over the past 2 weeks. Those representing Lonmin said Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa cannot be held responsible for the massacre of August 2012. There are claims that the mass shooting was a result of Ramaphosa's intervention.
Former Lonmin director Cyril Ramaphosa has repeatedly been accused of being the source of political influence in August 2012. He allegedly pressured some government officials, including former Police Minister Nathi Mthethwa, to act during the labor unrest at Lonmin. It's an accusation Ramaphosa has denied. And lawyers representing the platinum mining giant agree the deputy president can't be held accountable.
I cannot criticize Mr. Ramaphosa for doing what he did. He did what I submit a responsible businessman would have done in those circumstances. Try to stabilize the situation, get the police in.
Berger argues Ramaphosa was only trying to stabilize the situation and end the violence. He's also defended Lonman's decision not to negotiate with the striking miners. He says they were armed, unruly, and had ignored a court order.
If there had been talks here, it would have caused ripplings into the mining industry, which we would have today struggled to unravel, and it would have not have led to the avoiding of the tragedy on, in particular, the 16th.
Meanwhile, Ramaphosa's lawyers will not be making oral submissions. They say they stand by what is written in their papers and have nothing further to add. Bongiwa Kumalo, Centurion.
Well, closing arguments from the legal team representing the miners saw the police facing some tricky questions at the Marikana inquiry. The miners' lawyers say police should have warned protesters before they opened fire. Advocate Dali Mpofo says the Commission must take action against the former police minister as well as the National Commissioner. He also says Cyril Ramaphosa should be charged with murder.
I would encourage the Commission to take it even one step further.
Advocate Dali Mpofo hasn't held back. He's laden to Lonman, Cyril Ramaphosa and the SAPS. Mpofu argues that if this warning was issued to the media, then police should have done the same for the protesters. And Judge Farlam agrees.
Section 9.2 says, before you do that, you've got to give a warning in languages and all that kind of thing. And the Act made it clear he should have given a warning.
Absolutely, there's no explanation at all.
A high-level SAPS meeting on the eve of the shooting has also raised questions. Police have yet to produce any details or records from that gathering. But it's understood that the decision to disperse and disarm protesters was made that night.
That something unsatisfactory happened at that meeting, which they don't want to tell us. What exactly it was, I'm not sure. It may simply be, of course, that they said we've got to do this because if we don't do it tomorrow, Malema will be there on Friday, which would be an unsatisfactory thing to say.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it may be that's all they're hiding. But I must say at the moment, unless I'm persuaded otherwise, that prima facie it looks to me as if something's being hidden.
Yes.
Mpofu argues that the Commission can't still be looking for the cause of the massacre when it's clear that political pressure is the smoking gun. He also says if former Lonman non-executive director Cyril Ramaphosa is not charged, then nobody else should be brought to book either. A chance on Thursday for SAPS lawyers to submit closing arguments. But lawyers hit a snag when they argued the scope of the Commission's work is limited.
We ought to be careful in this commission not to make judicial findings. And by that I mean finding certain things to have been unlawful and finding certain things to be civilly liable and the like.
I have a problem at the very beginning of this line of argument. The terms of reference say the following. The Commission shall inquire into, make findings, and report on and make recommendations concerning the following, taking into consideration the Constitution, other relevant legislation, policies and guidelines.
Your report is an advice to the President. It cannot seek to be legal advice to the families and the injured.
You are correct in saying that we won't refer those to the President and say you do the necessary because for the reasons you give, it's not for the President to do the necessary. But clearly one of the things he wants us to do, has told us to do, is if we think it's appropriate, we must do the things that I've read out.
On Friday, police concluded their closing arguments.
There was enormous damage to property. Police officers had been killed. Security personnel has been killed. How much more can you expect an escalation? Would an escalation be another 10 more deaths by that time? 20 more that were to be contained? Of course, the threat in our submission is precisely the very fact that they are this many, they are this determined, they are this armed, and they pose a threat to law and order. That's what had to be contained.
Another chapter in the Marikana saga has come to an end.
We, the commissioners, will as diligently as we can, consider all the evidence and all the arguments that we've heard. And on that note, the Commission adjourns for the last time.
The Commission has a few tough months ahead. It has to take 300 days of evidence, arguments and counter-arguments into consideration and come up with recommendations. These will be compiled into a report and presented to President Jacob Zuma by the end of March. Bongiwa Kumalo, Centurion.
Coming up next on Week in One, a touching memorial for Annie Dewani, 4 years after she was murdered on her honeymoon in Cape Town.